Right now, in a gun shop in Paso Robles, California, a rifle sits on the rack carrying an action that traces its lineage back more than 65 years to a design so overbuilt that its original prototypes were reportedly pressure-tested well beyond anything a standard hunting rifle would ever need to survive. That action is the Weatherby Mark V. And for the first 13 years of the company that carries his name, Roy Weatherby did not own the design of a single action he sold. Every rifle that left his shop in those early years was built on engineering that belonged to somebody else. An FN Mauser action imported from Belgium, a Schultz & Larsen action from Denmark, occasionally a Mathieu action from France. Whatever a small California operation with no manufacturing plant of its own could actually get its hands on. He was building the fastest, highest pressure cartridges in the American hunting market, and he was doing it on rifle actions engineered decades earlier by other companies for other cartridges under other design assumptions entirely. None of them built with anything like the extreme velocities Weatherby was chasing in mind. That should not have worked for as long as it did. Existing commercial actions were being pushed toward the outer edge of what their original designers had ever intended them to handle, and Weatherby knew it and kept selling rifles that way anyway. Because a man with no factory does not get to wait for the perfect solution before he starts filling orders. It took until 1958 and a purpose-built action strong enough to finally match what his cartridges actually demanded, before Roy Weatherby stopped borrowing engineering that belonged to someone else and started building his own. This is the story of the 13 years in between, and the action that finally ended them. To understand why Roy Weatherby spent more than a decade selling rifles built on actions he did not design, you have to understand exactly what kind of operation he actually ran in those early years, because it was nothing close to what the word rifle company usually implies. Weatherby founded his business formally in 1945, working out of a small retail gun shop in Los Angeles, building custom high-velocity rifles for a growing base of customers who had read his public arguments about velocity and terminal ballistics and wanted rifles built to his specifications. This was not a manufacturing operation in any meaningful industrial sense. It was closer to a specialized gunsmithing shop, purchasing actions wherever they could be reliably sourced, rechambering and rebarreling them to accept the proprietary Magnum cartridges Weatherby himself had designed, and finishing them with the distinctive high-gloss stocks and styling that would become the visual signature of the brand. The actions he relied on most heavily in this period were commercial Mauser pattern actions, principally sourced from Fen in Belgium, supplemented at various points by actions from Schultz and Larsen in Denmark and Mathieu in France. Every one of these designs had been engineered originally for cartridges operating at conventional, moderate pressures. The kind of pressures a standard deer or elk cartridge of the 1930s and 40s generated, not the substantially higher pressures the Magnum cartridges Weatherby himself designed were beginning to produce as he pushed his velocity theories further and further. That mismatch is the actual engineering problem sitting underneath this entire story, and it deserves to be stated plainly rather than glossed over in the interest of a clean narrative. Roy Weatherby was, for more than a decade, selling rifles built on actions that had not been specifically engineered to handle the pressures his own cartridges generated, relying instead on the existing safety margins those actions had been built with for entirely different purposes, and on careful, conservative load development to keep actual working pressures within limits those older designs could reliably tolerate. This is the man this half of the Weatherby story actually belongs to. Not simply a marketer or a controversial theorist arguing with established gun writers, the subject of an earlier story on this channel, but a genuine operational problem solver, running a small, resource-constrained business, making do with the manufacturing reality actually available to him, while simultaneously pushing the ballistic performance of his cartridges further than the actions. Carrying them had ever been specifically designed to go, He was owed, at minimum, the kind of engineering partnership that would let him finally build an action matched to the actual demands his own cartridges were placing on it, rather than continuing indefinitely to borrow and adapt designs built for an entirely different, more conservative era of cartridge performance. For 13 years, that partnership simply did not exist. Weatherby did not have the capital, the manufacturing relationships, or the engineering staff required to design and produce a proprietary action of his own. And the established firearms manufacturers who did possess exactly that capability had, as an earlier Weatherby story on this channel documented, spent much of that same period publicly skeptical of the entire premise his business was built on. That left him in a genuinely difficult position, building increasingly extreme cartridges on increasingly borrowed engineering for longer than any careful firearms designer would normally consider fully comfortable, until the demand his rifles had generated finally became large enough and consistent enough to justify the serious capital investment a truly purpose-built action would require. Consider what running that gap actually meant day to day for the better part of a decade. Every new cartridge Weatherby wanted to bring to market had to be evaluated not simply on its ballistic merits, but against the specific limits of whatever action was currently available to build it on. A design instinct that wanted to push velocity and pressure further had to be constantly checked against the practical reality of an action never engineered for that purpose. A tension between ambition and available infrastructure that shaped nearly every decision the company made in those years, whether or not the resulting rifles ever advertised that tension to the customers buying them. Call this section a betrayal in a structural sense rather than the sense of a single villain, because the actual obstacle standing between Roy Weatherby and a proprietary action for 13 years was not any one company or any one decision-maker actively working against him. It was the basic economics of manufacturing scale in the American and European firearms industry of the 1940s and early 1950s. Economics that made it nearly impossible for a small, independent operation without established capital to design and tool up production for an entirely new action from scratch. Designing a proprietary bolt-action rifle receiver is an enormously capital-intensive undertaking. It requires precision tooling, forging capability, or investment casting capability depending on the manufacturing approach chosen, extensive prototype testing, and production scale large enough to make the upfront tooling investment financially viable. Established manufacturers like Winchester and Remington had that capital and that manufacturing infrastructure already in place, built up over decades of prior production. A small operation working out of a Los Angeles retail shop, however talented its founder and however innovative its cartridges, simply did not. That reality forced Weatherby into a specific, uncomfortable engineering compromise for over a decade. He was pushing cartridge pressures higher than most commercial actions of the era had ever been asked to handle, while relying entirely on actions designed by other companies, for other purposes, under other assumptions about what a hunting rifle would ever actually need to withstand. The FN Mauser actions he relied on most heavily were genuinely strong, well-regarded commercial actions in their own right, robust enough to handle the early Magnum loads Weatherby built with careful, conservative load development. But strong enough to handle it safely with careful engineering oversight is a meaningfully different standard than purpose-built to handle it with the kind of margin a truly matched design would provide, and everyone involved in the operation Weatherby ran during this period understood that distinction, even if the public marketing the company put out rarely dwelt on it. The specific engineering pressure point that eventually forced the issue involved the most extreme cartridges Weatherby had built. The 378 and later the 460 Weatherby Magnum. Rounds generating case dimensions and pressures that pushed meaningfully beyond what the existing commercial actions in the Weatherby supply chain could comfortably accommodate. A cartridge that large and that powerful genuinely needed a larger diameter bolt, a shorter bolt lift for faster cycling under recoil, and a fundamentally more robust receiver design than the Mauser pattern actions, however well regarded, had ever been built to provide. That is where the actual turning point in this story arrives, and it began not with Roy Weatherby alone, but with the arrival of a specific engineering partner who finally gave the company the technical capability its ambitions had been outrunning for a decade. Fred Jenney joined Weatherby as chief engineer, and beginning around 1954, Jenney and Weatherby together began the serious engineering work of designing a completely proprietary action from the ground up, built specifically around the demands the Weatherby cartridge line had been placing on borrowed engineering for far too long. The specifications Weatherby wanted are worth stating plainly, because they demonstrate a level of engineering ambition that goes well beyond simple showmanship or marketing flourish. The criticism most frequently leveled against him during this same general period by the established gun-writing authorities, an earlier Weatherby story on this channel, documented in detail. He wanted a short bolt lift for faster cycling. He wanted a full-diameter bolt rather than the reduced diameter design common to Mauser pattern actions. And critically, he wanted an action genuinely capable of safely handling his largest, most powerful cartridges without the careful, conservative compromises that borrowed Mauser actions had required for over a decade. The result, developed over roughly 3 years of serious engineering work, was a receiver built as what the company would later describe as 3 integrated rings of steel. A cylindrical receiver with an integral recoil lug, mated to a massive, one-piece, full-diameter bolt carrying 9 compact locking lugs arranged around its circumference. A fundamentally different and considerably more robust architecture than any commercial Mauser pattern action had ever offered. That is the actual technical betrayal underneath this story, if the word applies here at all. Not a company cheating an inventor, but an entire decade in which the ambition behind the cartridge designs Roy Weatherby built was allowed to outrun the manufacturing reality available to support them safely. A gap that persisted for 13 years not because anyone wanted it to, but because closing it required capital and engineering partnership that a small, independent operation simply did not possess until 1954 finally brought both. Here is exactly what Fred Jenney and Roy Weatherby built, and here is precisely why it mattered enough to finally end 13 years of borrowed engineering. The Mark V receiver was machined as a cylindrical shape, a genuine departure from the more angular, flat-sided receiver profile common to Mauser pattern actions, and that cylindrical geometry distributes stress more evenly around the circumference of the receiver under the extreme pressures the largest Weatherby cartridges generated. A meaningful structural advantage over the more traditional design the Mauser pattern used when operating at the outer edge of what a commercial rifle action would ever be asked to handle. The bolt itself represented the most significant departure from existing commercial designs. Rather than the reduced diameter bolt body common to Mauser pattern actions, Jenney and Weatherby built a full diameter bolt machined from a single piece of steel, carrying 9 relatively small, compact locking lugs arranged in a ring around the bolt face, rather than the 2 or 3 larger lugs typical of a traditional Mauser design. This arrangement distributed the locking force across a considerably larger total contact area, and it allowed for a notably short bolt lift, the angle the bolt handle needed to travel between locked and unlocked positions, letting a shooter cycle the action considerably faster than a traditional Mauser pattern bolt required. A genuine practical advantage for a hunter needing a fast follow-up shot on dangerous game. The company later described the overall design philosophy as 3 integrated rings of steel: the cylindrical receiver, the full diameter bolt, and the engagement between the 2 at the locking lugs, each ring reinforcing the others under pressure in a way that a traditional 2-lug Mauser pattern action built primarily for the more moderate pressures of 1930s-era cartridge design, had never needed to achieve. The action was engineered from the outset to handle the most extreme cartridges Weatherby built without the careful, conservative compromises the borrowed Mauser actions had required for over a decade. And company-sourced engineering accounts from the period describe prototype testing to pressures well beyond 100,000 pounds per square inch, a genuinely extraordinary figure for a commercial hunting rifle action of any era, then or since. That specific pressure figure comes from company-sourced material rather than independently published third-party laboratory verification from the period. And this script states that distinction plainly rather than repeating the number as independently confirmed. What is not in dispute is that the Mark V, once it entered production, proved capable of safely and reliably handling the full line of Magnum cartridges Weatherby offered, including the largest and most powerful 378 and 460 Weatherby Magnum rounds, without the load development caution that had constrained the earlier reliance the company placed on Mauser pattern actions. Getting the design into actual production presented its own genuine manufacturing challenge, a direct continuation of the same capital and infrastructure limitation that had kept Weatherby dependent on purchased actions for 13 years in the first place. The earliest Mark V actions were manufactured domestically by a specialized contractor. But demand for the new action quickly outpaced what that arrangement could reliably supply, and by 1959 Weatherby had established a production partnership with J.P. Sauer and Son in Germany, a company primarily known at the time for shotgun manufacturing, to produce forged Mark V action components and barrels at genuine industrial scale. That partnership, notably, made Weatherby the first American firearms company to offer hammer-forged rifle barrels, a manufacturing technique that produced meaningfully more consistent barrel dimensions and, in turn, more consistent accuracy than the conventional cut rifling process most American manufacturers still relied on at the time. That detail matters beyond simple manufacturing trivia. It demonstrates that once Weatherby finally had a genuine engineering and manufacturing partnership behind him, the company did not simply solve the single specific problem the Mark V had been built to address. It brought an entirely more sophisticated manufacturing philosophy into the American rifle industry alongside it. A philosophy that 13 years of building rifles on borrowed Mauser actions in a small Los Angeles shop had never given Roy Weatherby the capital or the infrastructure to pursue. Here is what the Mark V actually meant, both for the company and for the broader story of what a small, resource-constrained operation can eventually achieve once it finally closes the gap between ambition and manufacturing reality. The Mark V became, and remains today more than 6 decades later, the flagship action of the entire Weatherby product line, chambered in every major Weatherby Magnum cartridge from the original 257 and 270 through the largest 460 Weatherby Magnum, and eventually in a shortened 6-lug variant developed for the smaller 224 Weatherby Magnum varmint cartridge, introduced in the following decade. That range alone demonstrates something the 13 years of borrowed Mauser actions never could have reliably supported at true production scale. A single proprietary action architecture flexible enough to safely handle everything from a lightweight varmint round to one of the most powerful commercial cartridges ever offered in a sporting rifle. The manufacturing partnership with Sauer and the hammer-forged barrel technology that partnership brought into the American market extended benefits well beyond the specific Mark V action itself. Hammer forging produces meaningfully more consistent bore dimensions along the full length of a barrel than the conventional cut rifling process most American manufacturers were still using. And the accuracy and longevity benefits of that manufacturing approach became, over time, a genuine selling point for the Weatherby brand, independent of the velocity theories that had generated so much public debate in the earlier years of the company. There is a broader lesson sitting underneath this specific engineering story. One that connects directly back to the 13 years Weatherby spent building rifles on borrowed actions in a small Los Angeles shop. A genuinely original idea, in this case the conviction Weatherby held that a properly engineered action could finally match the true demands of the extreme cartridges he had built, is not, by itself, sufficient to produce results. It requires capital, manufacturing partnership, and often a specific technical collaborator, in this case Fred Jenny, whose engineering expertise complemented the instinct and ambition Weatherby himself brought in exactly the way a small operation working alone for over a decade had never been able to achieve on its own. That is worth stating plainly, because it complicates the simpler version of this story that a title emphasizing insurance salesman and no factory might otherwise suggest. Roy Weatherby did not simply will the Mark V into existence through sheer stubborn persistence alone. He needed 13 years to accumulate the demand, the reputation, and eventually the capital that made a genuine engineering partnership with a skilled specialist like Fred Jenny, and eventually with an established manufacturer like Sauer, actually possible. The insurance salesman with no factory is a genuinely accurate description of where he started. It is not, by itself, a complete description of how he actually finished. The Mark V action remains in continuous production today, having passed through manufacturing partnerships in Germany, Japan, and eventually back to the United States across more than 6 decades of continuous refinement. A level of sustained engineering relevance that very few proprietary rifle actions designed by any manufacturer in any era have ever managed to achieve. It began as the answer to a specific, urgent engineering problem. An ambitious cartridge designer whose own creations had finally outrun what borrowed 1930s-era commercial actions could safely and comfortably support. It became, over the following decades, one of the most respected and enduring rifle action designs in the history of the American sporting arms industry. That is the actual arc of this story, and it required considerably more than a single talented outsider working alone in a garage. It required 13 patient years, a critical engineering partnership, and a specific manufacturing collaboration with a company an ocean away before the fastest cartridges in the American hunting market finally got the action they had actually needed from the very beginning. So what does the Mark V story actually prove? It proves that the popular image of Roy Weatherby as a lone visionary who simply willed an entire product line into existence through sheer talent and marketing instinct alone is, like most simplified versions of a genuinely complicated story, missing the more interesting and more honest details underneath it. For 13 years, Weatherby ran a business that was, in the most literal engineering sense, outrunning its own manufacturing capability, selling increasingly extreme cartridges on rifle actions that had never been specifically designed to handle them, managing that gap through careful, conservative load development rather than through any fundamental solution to the underlying mismatch. That is not a story of pure triumph. And it is worth this channel stating that plainly rather than smoothing over the genuine engineering compromise those 13 years actually represented. Weatherby was, for over a decade, selling a product built on borrowed engineering that had never been matched to its true purpose. A real limitation that only ended once capital: demand. And a genuine engineering partnership with Fred Jenny finally arrived together in the mid-1950s. But look at what that partnership actually produced once it finally arrived. The Mark V action, built from the ground up specifically to handle pressures no commercial Mauser pattern action had ever been designed to comfortably support, remains in continuous production today, chambered in cartridges ranging from a lightweight varmint round to one of the most powerful sporting rifle cartridges ever commercially offered, manufactured across 3 different countries over more than 6 decades, and still recognized as one of the strongest, most respected bolt-action designs in the history of the American firearms industry. That is the actual verdict on the insurance salesman with no factory. He did not simply overcome the skepticism the establishment held through force of personality alone. The story an earlier video on this channel told about the gun-writing disputes that shaped his early reputation. He also had to overcome a genuine, extended manufacturing limitation of his own making. 13 years of ambition outrunning infrastructure before the fastest rifles on Earth finally got an action actually built to match them. Both stories are true. Both are part of the same man and the same company. And both point toward the same underlying lesson this channel keeps finding across the history of American firearms development. Genuine innovation rarely arrives complete and fully formed in a single moment of inspiration. It usually arrives in pieces, an idea here, a partial solution there, borrowed engineering filling the gap until the real solution finally becomes possible, and it takes an unusual combination of stubbornness, patience, and eventually the right partnership to see the whole thing through to an action strong enough to finally match the ambition that started it. Roy Weatherby had the ambition from the very beginning. It took him 13 years and Fred Jenny and a shotgun manufacturer in Germany to finally build the action that ambition had been waiting for the entire time. There is something worth sitting with in that specific sequence, the ambition arriving first and the capability arriving over a decade later, because it runs against the more comfortable version of the American innovation story this industry likes to tell about itself. The lone inventor whose brilliance and equipment arrive together in a single inspired moment. The real sequence is messier and, in its own way, more instructive. Weatherby spent 13 years managing a genuine gap between what he wanted to build and what he was actually capable of building safely. And the fact that he managed that gap successfully, without a serious accident undermining the entire enterprise, is its own quiet engineering achievement, even before the Mark V ever existed to finally close it properly.